We're not the next step. We're not gods. We're freaks. We're freaks. Mutants. You chose this and you ruined us. No more. No more mutants. So I am kidding when I say that comics were ruined after the Bronze Age, but there is something that reeks of a certain level of excess when looking at the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s of comic book history. The market became bloated thanks to speculation, and nearly cratered in on itself thanks to a confluence of factors. So this period of comic book history isn't always looked at with a great deal of affection, even if that isn't necessarily deserved. We shouldn't overplay the problems of this era, but we shouldn't really overlook them either. Everything went to the extreme, both inside and outside of the industry. So inside, characters got darker to the point of parody, while outside, bloat and gimmicks began to take more and more prominence within the publication patterns of Marvel and DC. And then the whole industry nearly collapsed in on itself, only for both of the big two companies to basically rework themselves into firming themselves up as two of the biggest multimedia franchises on the planet. We really don't need to get into all of that right now, but Magic was with this every step of the way. The Ultimate Universe, an alternate timeline featuring Marvel characters with a more modern take on their origins, initially made it a rule of their publication line that the Ultimate Universe itself would have no magic. But that rule was eventually abandoned because, well, there's just no running from it. Magic is too fundamental to fully avoid when talking about superhero stories, without diluting the fun and original purpose of both Marvel and DC. And that brings us to our next point, that magic is profoundly powerful. Oh, sure, at face value, that's an obvious, self-evident piece of information. Such magic is as powerful as any given writer decides it to be. Sure, on some level, magic represents that fear of the unknown I was talking about earlier in part 1 of this video. But this is far and beyond that. This is one of the core and often overlooked weaknesses of Superman. This is what makes Doctor Strange easily one of the most powerful beings on Marvel's Earth, depending on what writer and time period we're looking at. This is what made Scarlet Witch one of the greatest threats in all of modern Marvel. Magic is all at once the great equalizer, the ultimate trump card, and the most unpredictable force in the world of both Marvel and DC. It adds, wonderfully, to the abilities of writers telling stories within these fictional universes, for sure, as it gives them basically freedom to do anything. But it also gets into a core, fundamental, philosophical tenet behind Western superheroes, the idea of the Übermensch. Though the idea of Friedrich Nietzsche would later be used for some very colorful rhetoric we don't need to get into here, it also inspired the likes of Superman and other early superheroes. The idea behind it is that in rejecting God, the danger of nihilism looms. Without the values drawn from this figure, what meaning can we ascribe life? As European history began looking farther away from traditional Christian explanations for the universe and everything behind it, as we move beyond the Renaissance into the more modern era of human history, and the value of the scientific method and empiricism began to take hold, especially among academics, Nietzsche proposed the idea of an Übermensch, something that can create a new value system to avoid the trap of nihilism, and can be used to create a new goal humanity can set for itself, to find a deeper meaning, one life-affirming and creative. Superheroes, at their core, represent this sort of idealism. We see it in how they operate, how they inspire, and how they strive to be their best. The Übermensch was a direct source of inspiration in the design and creation of characters like Superman, though to be honest, this sort of protagonistic idealism does not begin or end with Nietzsche. This stuff is basically a core aspect of how we as the human race tell stories, long before any German philosopher. It is in Shakespeare, Beowulf, classic Greek myths, ancient Chinese fables. In almost every story and idea in human history, we tend to frame them in ways that best emphasize life values and traits we consider to represent the best of us as people. None of this is unique to magic, certainly. In fact, from this angle, and indeed most of the angles we've talked about so far, magic really isn't all that different in how it applies to superheroes than, say, science. After all, science is very powerful, and can be used to spawn heroes as easily as magic. It can be scary when used for nefarious purposes, and can also be cool or interesting, while it most certainly can also be viewed from a philosophical perspective, since it is a form of philosophy in and of itself, as a scientific method is a means for us to document and understand the world around us. But nobody would ever claim that magic was the same as science. And that begins the final point of this video and the present day. We need to avoid the use of the word modern, modernism, the modern era, postmodernism, and that sort of thing when describing art history or even human history in general. The label has been first used to describe DC Comics post-1984 in the comic book world, but in the broader scope of Western cultural history, the modern era as it originally was defined is so far in the distant past it basically predates comic books in the Western world. And it becomes tough and cumbersome in defining the culture era as it exists with what it once was but no longer is today when we call something the modern era. That last sentence is both an accurate and meaningless summary of the situation I'm describing, and if you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. It's stupid and pointless. It's labeling and kind of meaningless. It's why I don't like when we use terms like modernism or postmodernism to describe an era of comic book or art history in general. Because the landscape is changing and has changed and will change again within both Marvel and DC, and that's both necessary and a good thing. Oh, it's far from perfect, and I have plenty of complaints about the modern era. At their worst, Marvel and DC are responsible for plenty of cowardly decisions, endless events and soft reboots, and copying one another over the last decade or two. But at the same time, it's hard not to argue that both companies have done a really great job at telling new and interesting stories along the way. There is a lot of great artwork and effort behind comics of present day, and for every bland decision or series, I can name half a dozen or so great things going on from both Marvel and DC, let alone what we're getting out of the independent world of comics. The big two companies sort of wax and wane with one another, but between the growing success of the MCU, the return of Marvel and DC comics to form in recent years, and the advent of a lot of really good TV shows that really represent specific eras and comic book series from both Marvel and DC, well, things have me more excited than not these days. I suppose from the last decade or so, magic has seen a bit of a resurgence. I say that pretty reluctantly because magic has pretty much always been there to begin with in superhero history. But the needle has shifted ever so slightly in favor of magic compared to, say, 10 years ago. That much is clearly true. Major characters like Doctor Strange, Ghost Rider, Constantine, and Wonder Woman are increasingly in the public eye. Comic book movies, which once seemed to avoid magic like the plague, are increasingly embracing this stuff, and it really was one of the coolest parts of the movie Infinity War. So magic is back if it ever really were gone. And yet I can't help but feel this analysis is somewhat incomplete, or at least we're missing one last critical piece of the puzzle so far. For magic, at its core, is fundamentally irrational, in every sense of the word. Magic is without need for explanation or justification. And while in the real world that makes it vague and lacking falsifiability, in the world of fiction it is a wonderful thing. It allows for the exploration of the surreal. Writers and artists are given that true freedom, that key freedom in storytelling that magic allows creators to explore, basically only at the limits of human imagination, without the constraints and limitations of rational thought or laws of physics. And because we're talking about a form of entertainment and art, that is a wonderful thing. It allows for an attempt to get into genuine ideas about the nature of reality, metaphysics, and the meaning behind it all. A favorite topic of the likes of Alan Moore or Grant Morrison. Let's be clear at the mention of those two, this is not limited entirely to the modern age of comic books. I'm obviously referring to people who have been around for a good long while now. But it is something that has become less rare and more readily accessible in the modern age. Exploration of irrational and surreal ideas has become so commonplace it was practically expected in the major blockbuster movie Doctor Strange. That's an interesting thing to think about. I like these questions about metaphysics and the core principles of reality. It's easy to forget we're mere vessels of flesh with a series of windows out into the real world. These windows are organs designed to make sense of the world in a limited way that is best serviced by the environment beyond. When done properly, magic can explore our limits of perception. It can suppose worlds and ideas that our world is simply not connected to in any meaningful way. And I cannot understate how valuable that is. Yeah, there's 1.5 million reasons that a dragon couldn't exist, but how fun is it that we get to explore the idea of them, of being them or turning into them? How cool is it that these days I can drop the mention of a venom dragon and a good amount of you should know exactly what I'm talking about. Because yes, even a character like Venom can use magic as a vehicle to not only serve us a kick-ass story about a magic alien dragon god, but it can also explore surreal and irrational ideas. It can ask real questions about the self, identity, and what it means to be a sentient creature, or how connection between individuals in many ways defines existence, and how being, a sense of self, and personal identity are all intimately tied together. And that gets into a lot of fun that conventional academia surrounding philosophy and the arts in general can't achieve on its own. I'm not downplaying the value of serious written work in journals and academic publications in general. But you can have fun with fiction and use it to make serious plays into modern thought and ideas because the purposes of academic study don't benefit from the creative lens and challenges of entertainment.
Jeremy Bearimy, this is the timeline in the afterlife.
Genocide.
But random, dispassionate, fair to rich and poor alike.
I don't make them use them. They start these wars on their own.
The fourth chakra is located in the heart. It deals with love and is blocked by grief.
This is a way of pushing human thought and understanding. It's hard to come up with some of the crazier ideas apropos of nothing in Cates' current Venom series, until you're under the massive lens of modern Marvel history. That puts you at a very different perspective from a philosopher in an office writing a paper. And I think there's real value in using these things to explore these ideas, and using the ideas these characters and fictional storytelling presents to us to further philosophy and thought beyond just what we already know. Fiction feeds humans knowledge and ideas, while in turn research and academics become the grounds for new stories. Philosophy, history, and science are often used to inform and create new ideas and characters with Marvel and DC. But that doesn't mean that we can't in turn learn from even the most broad versions of this content. I have been speaking in broad terms for most of this video because I could go on forever if I started going through every single character and every single possible take of philosophy we could learn from each of them. Spider-Man, for example, even though he's not a very magical character and is pretty oriented towards science, could be used to explore a lot of ideas about determinism, but also the value of the scientific method itself. And let's not even get into the whole concern about ethics that surrounds the character and his principles, let alone his roster of villains and their history. Similarly, magic and magical characters offer pretty much an endless amount of interpretation from which we could explore. And while I'm not saying we'll never do this, we aren't going to do any of that here. We're just focusing on one topic, but I found it was kind of worth going over things in a sort of overture sense, to summarize and touch on some of these ideas without going into any one of them in any particular amount of depth. One last final thought worth noting as I start to wrap things up. As much as I do want to give the modern age credit for exploring more of the ideas behind magic, and both Marvel and DC can take some credit for this, the rise of the independent market in the modern age has definitely started taking the lead in exploring new ideas and themes in the comic book industry. By limiting ourselves to Marvel and DC, we are closing out some of the best creative work going on these days. But that's another series of matters entirely, and to be honest, I'm kind of glad we're just starting out with Marvel and DC for that reason. So that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching my two-part series on the history and philosophy of magic and its role in Marvel and DC. Obviously, this was a very basic overview of a very long and complicated history, and a very basic summary of some of the philosophical ideas explored through magic from these two companies over the years. But there's way more than that, and I do intend on covering this with other characters in the future at some point. So, like I said in the first video, if you guys have any ideas for other philosophy of characters or videos that you want to see along those lines, please let me know in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and if you liked it and haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island. We make all kinds of cool and interesting videos about comic books, and would love to have you guys join us. Finally, don't forget to like and keep reading comics.